Welcome everybody to the ADA Masterclass webinar. Today we have Professor Veerle Draulans joining from KU Leuven, Belgium. We are fortunate that she's visiting us at the Africa Center for Scholarship for the next 2 weeks. So welcome, Veerle. Thank you very much for joining us for the webinar. The webinar today will focus on including gender sensitivity perspectives in the different phases of a research project. Professor Dr. Veerle Draulans will deliver insights into the subject of including a gender and leaving no one behind principle in research by discussing the first so-called 3 fix model. Fix the numbers, fix the organization, fix the knowledge. Attention to each of these aspects is needed in a strategy for change. During the masterclass, Professor Dr. Veerle Draulans will offer critical reflections on the risks of gender-blind research. Intersectionality as a core concept will be illustrated from numerous concrete research examples. Beyond this practical information, the webinar promises to include a discussion on how each stage of a research project can be made gender and intersectionality sensitive. We will also open the masterclass to a Q&A later. So please, you're welcome to post your comments in the chat, and my colleague Kamogelo will be assisting this. Just a little bit of a background on Professor Draulans, just so I can just give a little bit of an insight into who is presenting and why we're obviously very happy that she is joining us at our center this next 2 weeks. So Professor Veerle Draulans is an associate professor in the Center for Sociological Research at KU Leuven, Belgium, with a full focus on gender and diversity in research and teaching. She is also the KU Leuven responsible for Inter-University Master Gender and Diversity in Flanders, a unique collaboration project between the 5 Flemish universities. She is the chairperson of the FLIR High Level Task Group on Gender and also the FLIR UOS Gender Diversity and Development Expert Group. Professor Draulans was co-chair of a work group in the COS program, Reducing Old Age Social Exclusion and Collaborations in Research and Policy. She collaborates extensively with South partners in Ethiopia, Rwanda, South Africa, and also more recently Bolivia. She is also a member of the Board of Governors of Emasos, a set of care facilities in Flanders, Belgium. So welcome, Veerle. We are very, very honored to have you as part of this webinar masterclass. And I'm going to hand over the presentation to you now. So welcome.
So, thank you for this kind introduction, and I'm very happy to be able to present to you and to participate in your web lectures program. So I'm Veerle Draulans, affiliated with Social Sciences KU Leuven and gender diversity expert, and it's really an honor to be in Stellenbosch in the context of my research sabbatical, and to be able to contribute to this webinar series. So what will we do during the upcoming more or less 50 minutes? I will walk you through this PowerPoint presentation, and I will explain what it means to make your PhD or your other research gender and diversity sensitive. But an online meeting always feels very limited, as I cannot see faces in front of me, and so it remains a bit impersonal by necessity. The whole group of participants in this webinar is quite heterogeneous, also in terms of research experience. So some of you are fairly at the beginning of your own research design, while others have several years or quite some years of research behind them. This makes it for me a bit difficult to assess or estimate your prior knowledge with regard to the subject of this presentation. So possibly my content is all quite new to some, while others may feel during the presentation that I'm underestimating their knowledge. But in either case, I would like to invite you to share your knowledge, to share your experiences, your examples during the plenary, the Q&A session following my presentation. Lonna Schebinger is an historian and a leading name in gender studies, and she developed, together with colleagues, this so-called three-fix theory. A minimum fix the numbers, a minimum number of the less represented groups need attention. In the field of science practice, this is often the case for women, especially in leadership positions. But the number of men or women also varies greatly by field of study or research. Think of the number of women in engineering or ICT versus nursing, for example. And I would like to add a small comment here straight away. All too often, I hear people talking about women and other minority groups. However, women are not the minority group socially. They make up half of the population. And when people talk about minority groups in this kind of generic term, minority groups, they seem to forget that within these minority groups, there are men and women. Both belong to this minority group. So let's focus on the second fix in Scheibinger's overview, fix the organization. We all know that having more women in our organization doesn't make the organization more gender sensitive. I like to refer to the example of Lady Thatcher, first female prime minister in the UK from 1979 to 1990. She clearly tried to strengthen her solo position as a woman by behaving distinctly masculine. She even practiced through speech therapy to make her voice sound lower so that she would be heard more in the extremely male environment that politics was at that moment and still is in many countries. So fix the organization demands to create working conditions and to create an organization culture that allows men and women to have equally fulfilling careers. An organization should examine every aspect of its operation, small or large, at every level, for gender and diversity sensitivity. This is what we mean by the concept of gender mainstreaming, making gender a gender-inclusive cultural mainstream. This should also happen at university or in organizations in which science is central. This calls for action related to recruitment, working conditions, monitoring, and management. But gender mainstreaming in university policy is not the theme of this web lecture. We will focus on the third fix today, fix the knowledge. But I did want to say something briefly about the fix the numbers and fix the organization, because these three fixed tasks are interconnected. For example, in a gender-sensitive organizational culture, it will be easier to draw attention to gender sensitivity at every stage of a study. Lots of useful information can be found on the website developed by Lonna Schebinger from Stanford University, and I will give you more information about that later on. So in gender studies, it's common practice to distinguish between sex and gender. Sex refers to physiological, and biological characteristics. Gender refers to the social, cultural aspects of the male and or female and the power relations between men and women. I don't think that this language, this distinction is new to any of you. And yet I want to mention it. Indeed, in the US, a number of people have been using the word gender to refer to biological sex as well, and for some time now. Some people feel that the biological sex as a term evokes too much the association of sex and sexuality, and they find that association vulgar or inappropriate. So today you can find texts referring to the gender of elephants or the gender of lions when it's only their biological sex that is meant. Would elephants or lions experience something like cultural determined expectations? Even if so, at least they can't tell us. A clear terminological distinction between sex and gender, it was developed at the time by anthropologist Stoller or sociologist Anne Oakley, is at least useful. I consistently continue to use Joan Wallace Scott's already somewhat older gender definition dating back to 1986, mainly because she very explicitly states that gender analysis by definition reflects power relations. Quite a few authors use gender as a purely descriptive term, and they forget the focus on power relations. Gender awareness is a first but insufficient step to effectively craft change. I may know that there are few male nurses, and this may have an impact on the organization of care. Or I may know that there are very few female ICT professionals, and this may have an impact, for instance, on the development of computer games. But it's not because I know something that I also think that initiatives are needed to change this situation. So awareness is a first step, but it's not enough. Gender blindness is the failure to recognize that the roles and responsibilities of men and boys or women and girls are assigned to them in specific social, cultural, economic, and political contexts and backgrounds. So projects, programs, policies, and attitudes which are gender blind do not take into account these different roles and diverse needs. There is no effort to recognize or to incorporate gender issues. By doing so, people maintain the status quo, and they will not help transform the unequal structure of gender relations. An example of gender-blind research is, for instance, always writing in generic nouns, such as the farmers, the pupils, the citizens, never questioning whether life and work is different for women as farmers, for female pupils, for women as citizens, whether they face different problems in their work. Often, for instance, authors in publications use such general terms: the patients, the refugees, the migrants. But we know very clearly from research that women who were fleeing from their countries often have other needs than male refugees. Think, for instance, of menstrual materials or a private toilet room. Women also often went through other and even more painful experiences of physical and mental violence along the way. And a generic term as the refugees, the migrants, renders such specific needs or experiences invisible. These photos illustrate the impact of a gender-sensitive approach. They are photos from northern Ethiopia in the summer 2018. The Ethiopian branch of an international NGO took me to a local community remote in rural area. Among other things, they wanted to show me the well that had recently been built there. In the original plan, they wanted to build walls around the well in a small house, believing that this would provide better protection from the weather, protection both for the technical installation and for the users, mostly women and sometimes young girls. But when discussions were held with the women themselves, the women asked that, above all, no walls would be constructed around the well, but that good visibility would be maintained, enabling a form of social control and a form of protection against possible violence. The women in the photo on the right were assigned to supervise the well. And this is a very concrete example of co-creation, of not about us, without us. Gender is only one dimension, one aspect of who we are. As a biological female person, I am doing, I am performing gender. For instance, in this morning in my decision what to wear, how to be dressed at university today. While I assume that none of the male colleagues even considered 1 second this morning coming to university wearing a dress. That is what we mean by performing, doing gender, behaving in line with certain gender expectations. But gender is only one dimension, one aspect of who we are. The Afro-American academic and activist Kimberly Crenshaw introduced the term intersectionality as a means to clarify that often not one dimension is creating vulnerability or privilege, but a combination of dimensions. In some situations, gender does not matter in how people react upon me, but it could be my age, or the color of my skin, or my family context, or the language, or a combination of dimensions. The photo you see shows our rector awarding a honorary doctorate degree to Kimberly Crenshaw on February 2, 2020, just before the big COVID outbreak and the first lockdown. Our university, on the recommendation of lecturers from the Faculty of Law, wanted to recognize her in this way for her pioneering work. But let's continue thinking about the issue of gender and leadership at the university. Merely focusing on fixed number of women is insufficient. Fixed numbers requires, from an intersectional perspective, including, for instance, skin color and race in the analysis. And from John Wallace Scott's gender definition, which calls attention to power relations, comes the question of whether women in leadership roles are accorded as much authority and are recognized as much in their leadership roles as their male colleagues. And what the same question would mean when we factor in skin color. This is an overview developed by a Canadian researcher, De Vries. He has published this overview and he published all possible dimensions of identity. And De Vries shows that even if we focus on one dimension of identity, people can still emphasize different aspects of this dimension. Take, for example, the example of age in the bottom right. At the bottom right, De Vries distinguishes respectively legal age, perceived age, expression of age, and identity, which refers to how, in one's perception, age contributes to one's own identity. Or let's take the example of gender on your left-hand side above. De Vries distinguishes between legal gender, normative gender, perceived gender, gender expression, and identity, which refers to how, in someone's perception, gender contributes to their own identity. I would like to add two small observations here. First, despite the 12 dimensions depicted in this overview, a student of mine of Indian origin remarked that caste was missing. Her remark was once again a wake-up call, because I never noticed before that caste was missing, but only based on her remark. It clarifies that the context we live in creates some blind spots. And the second remark is that Crenshaw herself puts into perspective attempts to list as many aspects of identity as possible. For her, it's not about counting possible dimensions. It's not about being descriptive, but it's all about identifying which cluster contributes to vulnerability or to privilege. So here you find a kind of summary of what a gender analysis does. It's a critical examination of how differences in gender roles, in gender activities, needs, opportunities, and rights or entitlements affect men, women, girls, and boys in certain situations or contexts. And it's clear that it should be integrated into all sector assessments or situational analysis to ensure that gender-based injustices or inequalities are worked about, and that where possible, greater equality and justice in gender relations are promoted. But let's move now and one step beyond, and let's take a closer look at how to apply this to each stage of a concrete research proposal. What I'm going to talk about is how to be gender and intersectionality sensitive in your own research. How can you pay attention to this at every stage of the research circle? I will not focus on gender-specific research, in which gender itself is the research team. And indeed, as the EU Gender Toolkit writes, related to energy technology, I quote, "The more technology-oriented research is, the harder it is to discover gender impacts, and the greater the efforts that must be undertaken because of lacking data and lacking research. Gender aspects are to be found or can be assumed in access to energy technology, in perception of risk technologies, in energy needs, in energy use, and in particular in the very small share of women in energy technology-related areas, resulting in an exclusion of their perspectives in research and development." So for areas of science that you think lend themselves little to gender analysis, the following starting questions can help. Who has access to these materials or to this topic? Who has control? Who is in the research group? How is the research group composed? Can this composition influence research or product development? Whose needs and experiences are taken into account? An interesting example of about product development has been made by Volvo years ago, because this thought exercise inspired the then CEO of Volvo in 2001 to have an all-female team design and produce a Volvo. Would this lead to a different Volvo car? The design made by the female team was met with cheers from some journalists. Some felt that their Volvo concept car, one car has been produced in reality, that it perpetuated gender stereotypes because the women had installed front and rear parking sensors, which was very unusual at that time. Parking sensors would confirm the stereotype that women cannot park, the critical journalist said. And guess what aspect of the female designed Volvo had become more or less standard in car design and production today? Parking sensors. But also the size of the airbags got attention. Airbags were made to men's size as standard, but turned out to be too big and even dangerous for pregnant women. This is an overview of a research circle, naming each phase of a research separately. I will give you some more examples about the impact or how you can integrate the gender perspective in your research. For example, healthcare, malaria disease control. Should one make an analysis in general terms, or should one pay attention to possible differences in exposure to malaria risks? We know that mosquitoes are more numerous near water. Due to specific gender tasks and positions in society, women and girls are more exposed to risk, as it is their job to fetch water or to do the laundry. Another example. Which idea do you have, and how would you describe what a heart attack looks like? The images you see in a film, by example, correspond more to the symptoms of a heart attack in men. And as a result, people sometimes recognize signs indicated heart failure in women too late. Conversely, anorexia nervosa in men has barely been addressed for a long time. The EU Gender Toolkit refers to research on skin diseases. When composing a study population, does one take into account that the clinical picture may manifest itself differently in men than in women? For instance, because men on average consult doctors later or are less inclined to protect themselves from the sun. Right away, I would like to comment on the use of the word on average, because statistically we generalize. We've increased risk of having little regard for an intersectional perspective or diversity in practice. When conducting research, we need to be constantly mindful of the tension between generalizing versus paying attention to diversity. You don't have to make this exercise alone. Meanwhile, there are several websites, handbooks, checklists, and so on available that can help you. I always refer again and again to a very solid and very scientifically based website affiliated with the prestigious Stanford University in the US and supported by a strong team of international scientists. In the video, which you can share and look up clicking on the link, the initiator, Professor Londa Schiebinger, motivates the importance of gender and diversity sensitivity. I can only recommend that you go to the website and that you take your time clicking through the various web pages. You will find masses of information that can help you in your quest to make your own research gender sensitive. The website provides numerous examples linked to major fields of science such as medicine, engineering, agriculture sciences, and so on. This is a screenshot of the homepage. If you click on General Methods in the bar on the left, you can choose further and you can read more about specific topics, such as thinking about sound, gender-sensitive research questions, thinking about language, and so on. You can also find checklists on these websites, which are very useful and specifically tailored to a specific research area. Here, I clicked through the health and medicine checklist, for instance. This website also, you can also send your email, and then on a very regular basis, you will get updates with the most recent information, recently published articles, and so on. Only yesterday, I got an email from the Londa Schiebinger and her team with new information, the most recent information. It's really, really very helpful information. Let's look at some examples, for instance, regarding methods and the influence. For instance, take in the field of engineering the example of facial recognition and how algorithms can make mistakes. A publication from 2017 found that when photographs depict a man in a kitchen, automated image captioning algorithms systematically misidentify this individual as a woman. So it's the kitchen which leads them to the idea of this should be a woman. Other research illustrated that darker-skinned women were often misclassified. Women also more often make use of makeup compared to men. But, and I quote from the Gendered Innovation website, facial cosmetics reduce the accuracy of both commercial and academic facial recognition methods by up to 76.20%. Other example. In social science research, it's common to set up one's own empirical research. But each method has advantages and disadvantages. For instance, not every researcher is a good interviewer. Or there are some people who do not like to talk a lot and who do not feel comfortable with an interview. Some researchers readily turn to focus groups, believing that this is a quick way to hear different opinions. However, there are many drawbacks to focus groups. Certain participants can be very dominant and determine the conversation. Some participants will remain silent. Body language is not recorded, and so on. And in line with the theme of this web lecture, you might ask whether mixed male-female focus groups sufficiently guarantee that everyone can speak out freely and be adequately addressed. And of course, the biological sex and gender ideas of the researcher or the interviewer matter too. For instance, teams of international peacekeepers really had to experience that it was best to let women do the interviews with women who may have been victims of acts of sexual violence and rape during war conflicts. This seems to be evident and a given now, but it was not so in the 1990s, for example. This is a similar research circle taken from the EU Gender Toolkit checklist. The orange-yellow outer circle refers to the organizational culture and organizational structure needed to facilitate gender and intersectionality sensitivity. You can compare it to the fix the organization dimension from Londa Schiebinger. So here they argue to select a mixed team of men and women to create gender and equal working conditions, to value women's and men's work equally, and to manage and monitor gender equality. The red circle refers to gender and intersectionality sensitivity in the concrete research phase and distinguishes between the research ID phase, the proposal phase, the research phase, and the dissemination phase. And with each of these four stages come two specific points of interest. In the research ID phase, they ask whether there is an idea would be gender sensitive or diversity sensitive, and whether the assumptions and the presuppositions that you yourself make to this idea are gender and diversity sensitive. When writing a research proposal, one should question whether the research questions are gender and intersectionality sensitive, and whether the methodology you intend to apply is gender and intersectionality sensitive. In the research phase, it's about data collection and data analysis. Are data analyzed in a gender-sensitive way? And the dissemination phase requires to pay attention to the language used in the report you write, and that you pay attention to how you would organize disseminating activities and whom you would invite. But this sounds very theoretical, I know, and that's why now I would like to give you some examples what to do more concretely. So let's focus on the research ID phase. Imagine that you have a brilliant idea that you want to explore, or that you have been recruited as a researcher to develop a brilliant idea someone else had. Or just think back to the very early days of your own research and your own investigations. How did the idea originate by them? How did it grow? Who did you talk to about it? Only with peers? How was the peer group composed? Like-minded people? Or did you consciously step out of the comfort zone of like-minded people and challenge other perspectives on your topic? If so, why? And what profile did these people have? Did you talk about your research idea with people outside the research world? For instance, at home or with friends having a chat at a cafe, drinking a beer or a wine? And did this lead to any surprising or additional insights? Have you ever wondered whether your own research would look somewhat different should you consciously include gender and intersectionality perspectives? And what aspects of intersectionality from the Vries diagram might be relevant to your research? Or are you hesitant to bring in a gender and intersectionality perspective explicitly because you don't feel comfortable with it? Or because you think or you know that not everyone in your research group is really convinced of the scientific value of that perspective? Or maybe some colleagues think it's ideology and not science. Let's take then a closer look to the phase of the writing a research proposal. Forming a good research question is crucial. It's central. And every word in a research question, in the central research question, matters. Every word counts. Also, the participation of all stakeholders in drawing out the research lines is important. A central research question defines what information will be gathered and how, who the stakeholders involved are, and it defines the potential impact of the research. And again, I would like to stress that it's necessary to think carefully about each word of the central research question. Every word matters, and interdisciplinary alertness is needed. A regrettable but well-known example is an example we all are familiar with: social distance in COVID times. The concept was introduced from medical sources, epidemic studies. But people meant factual, physical distance. And this is very different from what social scientists understand by social distance. But before we could correct the use of the word social distance in COVID times from a social science perspective, the concept was already coined and internationally used. Words matter as they contribute to visibility and invisibility. I will give you some examples. For instance, let's consider the sentence, climate change is affecting life of the population in local communities. Who comes spontaneously to your mind when you hear talk of local communities? Or when you hear the word population? Who comes spontaneously to your mind when you hear talk about farmers or fishermen? What comes spontaneously to your mind when you hear the word household? Would you think about female-headed households? In certain regions around the world, the percentage of female-headed households is quite high, due to the absence of the partner due to violence, conflicts, labor migration, and so on. And female-headed households can face very specific challenges. In northern Ethiopia, for example, women are banned from plowing. There is a taboo on women and plowing. Women have to hire male labor to plow their land, which obviously leads to additional expenses. How can we give visibility to these experiences? Other example. What kind of work do you spontaneously think of when you hear the word work? Most often, only productive, paid work is valued in economic analysis or research. Unpaid work is left out of the analysis. I learned in the women's movement in the 1980s to systematically distinguish between three forms of work: occupational work, professional, paid work, work within the family context, unpaid work, and social work, which is volunteering in organizations, civil society, or informal work. Unpaid work, which is very often done by women, remains totally invisible in much research. This also applies, for example, to research on agricultural activities. Activities that yield financially are included in research, for example, about food production. But food production for one's own family, which is not sold on the market, remains more invisible. Last but not least, regarding the word work, what does the word work reveal in the context, for instance, of 40% unemployment, as is the case in South Africa? In your research, you need to think about all the stakeholders involved in a specific or related to a specific team. And regarding the stakeholders, we easily think that we are effectively engaging all stakeholders. But what does involve mean? And how heterogeneous, how diverse dare we make this group of stakeholders? The Vries diagram, with all these diverse perspectives on intersectionality, can provide inspiration to get a good grip on how and where diversity makes sense in your research. But ensuring factual diversity is one thing. Paying attention to the underlying power and hierarchical relationships is two, and perhaps the most difficult. All this also requires self-reflection of ourselves as researchers. How do I behave? What do I think? And also, methods matter. So it's important to think carefully about the most appropriate research method to answer your central research question. And the gender and intersectionality sensitivity comes also in here too. The Garcia toolkit refers to, and I quote, if you're conducting surveys in your research, or if you are disseminating questionnaires, design your questions so that they are relevant to both women and men. Pay attention to language, to images. Avoid images that reproduce stereotypical gender roles. If you're conducting policy analysis, be aware of the gender ratio in decision-making bodies, end quote. And probably it seems to you a bit strange to refer to gender-related issues in questionnaires. But a very clear example, I can give you a very clear example of research I was involved in. It was about evolution in the sense of in religious practice and religious attitudes in Europe over several years, 40 years. And we also included more and more countries in the research project. It was a European Values Survey. And some of the questions that we asked in the very first phase were for a specific group of respondents not longer valid, namely questions related to religious practice for Muslim women, because in Muslim countries, the women were not supposed to go to the mosque. But the questionnaire had been developed at the beginning with Christian people in mind. So there were questions about, do you pray? How often do you go to church? And so on. And then at a certain moment, we included more countries, also, for instance, Turkey was included. And then for female respondents in Turkey, for instance, or in Muslim countries, this was a strange question. How often would you go to the church? Because they normally don't go to church, or not too often. So that's where this kind of sensitivity, that's an example of this cluster of an intersectional perspective in survey. And the argument used not to change the survey questions was that there were different various waves. So every 10 years, they would conduct the same survey, And they needed to use, or they wanted to use the same questions in order to be to enable the comparison with the answers in the former waves. But that was for us as researchers really also a challenge. How shall we deal with it? Which solution shall we opt for? But for the female respondents, it was very for the female Muslim respondents, it was a strange question because it made not so much sense for them. But okay, that's only one example. You really can meet these challenges or these issues, or you will meet them more often than you would expect them. But let's return to my theoretical framework, let's see. So when you use a document analysis as a source of information, did you ever reflect about the question whether women were involved in drafting these documents? Or would you intend to include, for instance, reports written by women's organizations? When you go and to interview stakeholders or policy people, remember that in a lot of sectors, very few women are executives. So in what you see as a legitimate search for privileged witnesses, people in leadership positions in policy making, you may still very explicitly miss certain perspectives. Quite a few researchers also opt for focus group discussions and consider it a relatively easy and quick method to hear different voices speaking. However, there are quite a few methodological pitfalls associated with focus groups, as I told you before. So in some cases, same-sex focus groups may be more valuable. And if hierarchical structures are present, women will feel more comfortable speaking about certain topics without the presence of men. It's also necessary to ensure that the moderator of the focus group has received sufficient training in gender sensitivity, or get a female moderator for women's only focus groups and vice versa. And it may sound a bit surprisingly, but the timing of data collection can also have gender and diversity implications. I read once in the education statistics of a specific country in Africa that more than 90% of all children attended primary education. However, when I was in rural area because of data collection during the months of May and June, I saw young girls everywhere who were, with their mothers, carrying cartloads of wood on their backs, but clearly not in school. Asking for an explanation for the contradiction between the statistical information and what I saw, my colleagues replied, the data for education enrollment are collected in the first week of the school year, but now there is work to be done in the fields. Let's move on to the research dissemination phase. Of course, you want to make your research findings public. You want something to be done with them politically or policy-wise. You want to make people aware of the importance of what you research. But what message do you want to give to whom? Will that message differ depending on which audience you have in front of you? Which people, which organizations do you want to invite to such a public moment? Can you assess the degree of gender and diversity sensitivity of those organizations? Can you take into account hierarchical relationships between the audience present? An INSTRA gender checklist refers to the fact that in quite a few contexts, women hardly get any opportunities to express their ideas. They are not invited to do so. Their knowledge is not noticed, and they are not at all used to speaking in public or being consulted. So spontaneously, they will remain silent, or at best add something at the very end of a meeting. Anticipate as a researcher such situations in the preparation of your dissemination activity. I refer here to what I could observe no longer than a week ago. Two of my PhD students in an African country are working on maternal health. One almost finished, the other at the start of her PhD. Both focus on why many women in their region still give birth at home, do not go to a health center, and thus give birth without the help of a skilled professional. We organized a workshop to listen to the voices of a lot of stakeholders. 1/3 of the attendees were women. Quite a few academic staff are present. Guess who spoke? And guess who remained silent on a topic like pregnancy and childbirth? And at the end, the male moderator answered the questions, not the female PhDs. So conclusion, until the bitter end, you have to keep paying attention to gender and diversity sensitivity. So I would like to formulate three concluding, not really concluding remarks, but it's better to name it observations. First, researchers who ask to pay attention in research to minority experiences or to women's experiences may easily be labeled as subjective researchers. But the people who label them as subjective seem to be blind for the fact that years of denying or of overlooking or being blind for the experience and perspectives of minorities or of women in research, that their research was called objective. Second, constantly calling attention to these issues sometimes provokes resistance. You will have to learn to deal with that resistance. It requires a certain resilience. It requires to keep pleading for visibility again and again. And third, what years of working on gender and leaving no one behind have taught me is that it's always about visibility. Giving visibility, taking visibility, getting visibility. Who is made visible? Who is made invisible? Who gets visibility? Who is kept invisible? And scientific research can contribute significantly to this without becoming less scientific. And I hope this will work. I would like to share a small video from referring to a lecture from the Nigerian writer Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, in which she talks about the danger of one single story. I hope. Yeah, okay, there we go. 6 minutes. So I would also like to thank you for listening, and I hope my contribution could give you a bit of inspiration, a lot of motivation, and that we all remember that there's not such a thing as one single story. Thank you all, and I'm curious to listen to your questions. Thank you so much for attending this web lecture and being with us.
Thank you very, very much, Professor Draulans, for enlightening us just in terms of how we really need to be gender sensitive and also intersectionality in terms of identity, culture, and class that you also mentioned was missing in the previous diagrams that you had. So I think going forward, it is definitely something that we need to concentrate as researchers when looking at our subject field, even from the beginning when we are looking at writing our research question and taking it from there. We're going to open it now, and I'm going to introduce my colleague Kamor as well, who will be taking on various questions from the audiences. Please feel free to ask them in the chat, and my colleague will assist with the question section. Thank you very much.
So you use it or you keep your own cuttings.
So can I ask if there are any questions in the chat that I can address to Professor Draulans? Otherwise, perhaps we can maybe just start with one question. In terms of when you are actually doing your research, of course, you have to focus on intersectionality and understanding who the stakeholders are when you're going to be conducting the research and not just taking it from one perspective. Professor Draulans, would you also suggest in terms of you and your own position in doing the research, would you also take that as a very big factor, as myself as being a female that will be doing research on a particular policy? For example, my field is policy analysis. How would I go about that? And would that also be a contributing factor in writing the research as well, and not just taking it from our participant side?
Yeah, I didn't focus too much on. I must admit that I actually forgot to tell at the end that self-reflection is always crucial. Also, self-reflection as a researcher is crucial. Not only at the beginning, knowing very well why you are interested in this specific research question. But of course, this requires that I, as a researcher, have free choice about the subject of my research, and quite some for young researchers and for PhDs, for instance, they often don't have have no free choice about the subject or about the research question, because they applied for a position, but often the position is connected to a specific subject which has already been designed before they even applied. So that's something different. When I have when I, as a researcher, as a professor, can choose the subject I will work about, of course there is often this kind of the strong personal interest. And I should also be aware about the impact of a specific interest and how it influences my ideas, my sometimes also my stereotypes, the blind spots I have, that's why I stressed and I focused on the fact that I consider it very important to in this ID phase at the very beginning to talk with a lot of people about what you intend to do. And I didn't mention it, but probably you may remember that on my PowerPoint slide about that ID phase, there was the picture of the cover of Thomas Kuhn's book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. It's a book that dates back to the end of the 1960s. And he, as being a social scientist and also interested in philosophy, he reflected on how the big paradigm shifts in science, how this paradigm, this shift was created. And for me, it's useful because he suggests that it was thanks to questions of so-called outsiders that people learn to think outside of the box of what the stream they were supposed to think. So research at that moment was very strongly oriented to my professor knows a lot of things. I learned what he knows. It was about he at that time. And I will add some more new information to what he and the other ones knew yet. But you just go in the same line. And an outsider who asks you questions that seem to be strange, stupid questions, they sometimes give you a suggestion. Why is it like this? Why would you investigate it like in this way? What in case you take this angle, this perspective, and then so you get innovation. Then the new ideas come. And then, of course, the question is, who are the outsiders in science? For a very long time, women were the outsiders. Nobody investigated subjects that were related to women's lives. And also, minority groups were the outsiders of science. Their perspective was never included. And that's why I used there the picture of the cover of The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. But I think for instance, first-year PhDs who applied to make their PhD in a project where someone else defined the subject, it's much more difficult to design their own way. I can imagine that for them, for instance, if they work in a context or in a research group where some people are convinced that gender and intersectionality sensitivity, that it is a kind of ideology, or that your scientific work is less scientific when you add this angle, yeah, as a first-year PhD, you're not really in a position that you would say, no, I will include it. And that's where the power relationships also in academic relations come in. So I do see the point, but it's, yeah, I always invite my students, be it researchers, be it PhD students, be it master students or bachelors, doesn't matter, to reflect about their own positions, their own privileges, own vulnerability situations, but also how these influence their scholarly ideas. I hope this is an answer to the question of, I don't know whose question.
No, very important. Thank you very much. Kamal, perhaps?
There's a question from the chat side. Thank you so much, Prof, for a very insightful and informative talk. So we have a question from David, and they say, thank you so much for the presentation. The question they have is about effectively managing and noting the various facets of research participants' identities. So in their research, race, class, national identity and religious identity are key markers. This presentation raised for them the importance of not erasing gender in their work. So the question is, how does one ensure, while doing justice to the complexity of identity, that one does not end up in the terrain of constantly caveating and totally avoiding generalization? Are there specific tools that that are helpful and can be suggested for managing this tension? And the question is quite echoed by a number of participants in the chat.
Mhm. Thank you for your question. It's a difficult one because it's also about the methodology you would like to use then, or you prefer to use. But it remains important to try to get grip on whether in the specific context you are investigating. For instance, the experience of religiosity or the religious practice means something else for men related to or for women. So I hope that my example of the European Values Survey and the issue of measuring religious practices for Muslims and the women who were not expected to go to the mosque, so that they considered this a strange question. So it's this kind of information that you need to find. And I think to get grip on that, the first step would be that on the moment of your literature analysis, when you prepare your work, you read what all other people have written and published yet before, that for each of these dimensions of identity, you're trying to find information about this religion in this region, the region that we investigate. What does this religion require from men to do? And what does it require from women? Is there a difference? In case you would find that there are very few differences, it wouldn't impact your research too much. But religion is a difficult one because for many religions or denominations, counts that women are much more involved in the religious practice, but these are other practices or other rituals or in other contexts than the men do. So I would also investigate, for instance, nationality is a difficult one because depending on the size of the country, nationality of the people doesn't say too much about the very specific values people have, the very specific habits they have. So it's always an issue of trying to avoid this generalization. What I see the point that in the end you wouldn't dare to conclude anything anymore, but I think it's very important that in case you would be unable to distinguish too much or to dig too much into detailed information, trying to get grip on the impact of intersectionality on your research topic, the minimum you could do is at the beginning inform the readers, inform the audience about what you tried and that you are aware about these limitations. And also at the end, in the concluding part, I would once again also refer to that. And you can always suggest that this is an issue for future research to refine this point. But I know it's a difficult one. But you all know that, for instance, referring to nationality is, yeah, I know the problem because, for instance, once again, my collaboration with the European Values Survey at that moment, it was also strongly, the reports were also country linked. And then you start to speak in terms of, or to write in terms of the Portuguese people believed that. The Germans believe that. But when you focus on country data, immediately we could, for instance, find differences in the way how people who lived in the former Eastern German side parts had some different ideas compared to the people living in the former Western Germany regions. But you generalize it away because it becomes the German voice. And that's a difficult one to deal with. But I would, for sure, I would mention it at the beginning and at the end, at least to illustrate to the audience that you're aware about these limits. Hope this is an answer to a bit of an answer, not a solution, but a bit of an answer.
So there's a follow-up question from Kathleen. So with regard to the challenge of generalization question, you are suggesting more nuanced consideration, conceptualization of identity. Therefore, could you please give us the source for the slide you showed with the graphic illustration of the complexities of identity?
That's the one of the Vries. Okay,
yes.
I can show that one. I will send it to Natalie, and you can share it, or I can add it. What I can do is add it here in on the final slide. What you see now on the screen, the final slide, are the other checklists which are available. You can find on the internet easily, but De Vries, indeed, it's one publication. I only find it once. I think a publication of 2016. I even think that when you Google De Vries intersectionality Canada, that you will find it easily. But I will send a concrete reference to Natalie. Once again, it's important to notice. Oh, sorry.
Oh, you can continue. You can continue, Prof.
Okay, sorry. Related to De Vries, keep in mind that I use it as a tool of inspiration, but for Crenshaw, she jokes a bit in some. You can find some. It's easy to find videos online from Crenshaw on YouTube, from lectures, and she is making jokes about the attempt of some researchers who try to define as many aspects of identity as possible. And De Vries refers to 12. Yeah, he forgot one, huh? As I told you. And she refers to the fact that some German, I think it was German, researchers identified 17. And then she said, but they missed, by doing so, you missed the point. It's not about finding as many as possible. It's searching for what makes me what makes me privileged, which cluster makes me privileged, in which situation, in which context, which cluster makes people vulnerable, in which situation, in which context. And it's possible that these are 2 or 3 or 4. But it's useful to give you inspiration, because what I like on De Vries is that he also added this dimension that when we talk about our research, for instance, now we talk about gender and intersectionality. He suggests immediately that put 5 people around the table, make them discuss gender without asking them before to define what the concept of gender means for them. Probably you all speak or share ideas, having a different idea in mind about what gender means for you. And that's why I like this scheme of De Vries, because it gives us inspiration for the necessity to define or to explain to other people. When I refer to age, for example, which dimension of age am I referring to? and it's possible that you would use age in another context. But for Crenshaw, it's about vulnerability privilege. And that's an important distinction, I think. Is that a bit of an answer?
I certainly hope that it was. I have. So there's also a question from Mela, and they say that I think regarding generalization, we tend to want to think experiences between certain identities will be the same, but they cannot be the same if you position yourself in a constructivist paradigm. If you do a survey exploring differences between gender, race, etc., in a positive way, you would need such a very broad population. Is our point actually to generalize when we want to understand people's experiences? I tend to want to, but I don't think I can or should.
Yeah, it's always this tension you have. What I would suggest is if your research project allows you to opt for data triangulation and try to include, try not to limit yourself to, for instance, our survey quantitative analysis, which leads to much easier to this kind of generalization, and try to add a bit of qualitative study. But on, on the other hand, if possible, avoid to limit yourself to a number of interviews, because then you rather quickly run the risk that it would be that your results present the experiences of a limited group of people. And it's always again and again trying to balance between both. But I think there is nothing wrong with, and it would be good if more people would, at the beginning of a publication, at the beginning of a dissemination activity, clarify that you know, that you are aware about the limitations of the options you made. And that would be an important step already, to name it. And there's nothing wrong with limitations. There is, what is wrong is to suggest that your findings are the one single story to be told. That's why I wanted to end with Aditye's talk, despite she is a writer and not a researcher. But the message is, let's avoid this one single story conviction.
There's no any question in the chat, but I think last question, quick one from me. I think so the question around fixing the knowledge and fixing the numbers, do you think that we can fix the knowledge without fixing the numbers, or can one group via a gender sensitive, a culturally sensitive study fix that knowledge without necessarily having the numbers that are representing what you're trying to address?
Well, when we believe in not about us, without us, or when we believe in co-creation, yeah, you need the numbers. But with regard to gender, people often make the mistake or are convinced that more women in a group would automatically lead to a more gender sensitive approach in research. I know quite some colleagues who really are, and I need to think how to phrase it best, not to blame anybody, but who explicitly tell me that they are grateful for gender research, but they won't call themselves or want to be named a feminist. So it's not because the numbers increase that automatically this perspective and this sensitivity for vulnerability and privilege also increases. You can use your position as a woman, you can also to defend your privileged position. Yeah, and that's that. It's the numbers don't guarantee the knowledge sensitivity, but the numbers are a precondition. That's why I like the 3 fixed model. You need the 3 dimensions together in order to progress. And that's why I also added the example of Lady Thatcher, because she was the example of, she was the leading lady, but she behaved more masculine than her male colleagues. It's a kind of survival strategy for some in a solo position. Right? But we need the 3, but only the numbers doesn't guarantee the awareness.
Thank you so much. That answers my question. Natalie, I'll hand over to you.
Thank you very much, Kamalgero. So just to wrap up, thank you very, very much, Professor Draulans, for joining us. Again, we're very excited to have you not just online, but also in person on our side, which is fantastic. And also thank you very much to my colleague Kamalgero Matachi, who also assisted with the Q&A section, and also all my other colleagues. And also I'd just like to say thank you to everybody that's joined for our webinar today. We will continue to have these masterclass webinars on a monthly basis. So please feel free to join. We will send out and circulate the information on our social media platforms, as well as on our newsletter. I see we have somebody that raised their hand. Was that a hand, or was there just a quick, perhaps just a slight change on it? But yes, so what we're going to do now is we're going to try and circulate the slides and the presentation to the people that have joined. But thank you very much for joining, and we look forward to the next one. So thank you.
Thank you all for attending and for sharing ideas. Bye.
Bye. Thanks.